All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our State Library virtual Lunch and Learn today, featuring Pennsylvania authors. Today's talk is about the esteemed Henry Shoemaker, a giant among literary figures. As an author and owner of Sunbury Press Incorporated, Lawrence Knorr, our guest speaker today, has expanded its Catamount Press imprint, focusing on the literature of Western Pennsylvania. Knorr has been publishing new editions of Shoemaker's many books, updating them for modern audiences. Along the way, he has come to know Shoemaker's work in his biography, dubbing him Pennsylvania's Mark Twain. While not always historically accurate, Shoemaker was always entertaining. This presentation is about Shoemaker and his publications. Lawrence Knorr has co-authored or authored over 30 books, mostly on history and biography. He's a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, the Sons of the American Revolution, and numerous other historical organizations. He enjoys writing most about the formerly famous and his beloved Pennsylvania Dutch culture. He is a lifetime Penn State alum and holds a PhD in history from Liberty University. So please join me in welcoming Lawrence Knorr today.
All right. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks.
And thank you all for having me here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, Henry Shoemaker. As you've heard, I've been calling him Pennsylvania's Mark Twain. Maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole, but we'll see. Give me a chance. So I will cover the comparison to Twain very briefly, and then we will go into who was Henry Shoemaker, what did he write, including some examples I'll read for you. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion on some of the issues with Shoemaker in his life and with his writings, and then a little bit about our new editions. So I'll just skip over this since we've already talked about me. No need to talk about me anymore, except I will say that Sunbury Press now has over 700 authors under management, 1,700 titles. So we've really grown in recent years, and thank you to those that are on that have helped make that happen. Why do I compare Henry Wharton Shoemaker to Mark Twain? As you can see, Mark Twain on the left, originally called Samuel Clemens, 1835 to 1910 versus Shoemaker, born 45 years later. Their lives do overlap a bit, and I can't say that Shoemaker was influenced by Twain, but he had to have been. Just about everybody was in some way. But there are some interesting similarities. And as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, of course, Shoemaker is a giant among Pennsylvania authors. So you can see that both were writing around the same time, at least overlapping a bit. Both were prolific. Interestingly, they were both publishers at one time in their lives. Clemens later in his life gets into publishing, even assists with the publication of Ulysses S. Grant's biography. Shoemaker, he gets into publishing very early and essentially is self-published for just about everything that he does. Same with Mark Twain. They were both very well connected. Obviously, Twain nationally with national figures, Shoemaker more so with Pennsylvania figures, and then those that get into federal government, he also has good connections there. But when it comes to their work, this is where I really see similarities. Both were excellent short story writers. Especially, they were really good listeners. They were good at relating stories that they heard from others, and they often claim this was told to me by somebody at a tavern or somebody at a lodge, and then they tell the tale. They were both masters of writing about place. Twain, of course, early on, he's in California, and he writes about the gold fields in that area of California. And then later on, writing about his youth on the Mississippi River and other events there, and makes a very rich portrayal of it. Shoemaker, almost exclusively the Western Hills, the Alleghenies, the Appalachians, whatever we want to call them, the hills of Western Pennsylvania, his adopted home. They both invented, now I say invented, in some cases they claim these were real people, but when you read about them, it's sometimes hard to believe that person really existed, but sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And I would say they both invented interesting and often humorous local characters, people that were sort of salt of the earth, just strange, uh, eccentric, maybe is a good word. And both were adept at describing scenes. They could paint a very vivid picture. And as we read their work from an historical context, it is really interesting in that regard. Especially me as an historian, reading them, I place myself back in the past and imagine what it was like. So I really think there's a lot of similarities. And if you've read Twain and you haven't read a lot of Shoemaker, I encourage you to do so. So who was Henry Wharton Shoemaker? Well, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And the Shoemaker family on Manhattan was right up there with the Roosevelts, the Astors, and some of the other big names. If you're watching the HBO series, The Gilded Age, just imagine Henry Shoemaker as one of the guys in the top hat walking down the street. He would have been that. He attended Columbia College, called Columbia College then, of course, Ivy League. He did not graduate. There's many articles about him that claim he was a Columbia grad. Well, he dropped out. In fact, I don't know how well he did, probably not very well. He seemed to be more of a party boy, not very focused on education. But somewhere along the way, he learned to write very well. And that's what he ends up taking up later on. But as a young man, his brother got into equities in New York, like a lot of people, trading on the stock market. But his brother was then killed in an accident at a very young age. And this turned Henry away from that. He decided to find some freedom visiting with his maternal grandparents in Pennsylvania. And he absolutely loved to visit McElhattan, Pennsylvania, out near Lock Haven in the hills. His grandparents' home was there, and he spent a lot of time there. In fact, ultimately, he transitions from New York City to McElhattan for most of the rest of his life. He does travel quite a bit, and he has some overseas experiences, of course, but less and less time in New York, more time in Pennsylvania. So this grandmother, his maternal grandmother, Cordelia Quiggle, love that name. She passed away, I believe, in the teens. Henry's a young man in his 30s. His grandfather had already passed, and he inherited the estate in McElhattan. I guess the family pretty much said, Henry, you love it, you can have it. And then he names it Restless Oaks, and that's how it is known ever since. He then goes through a couple marriages. I'm not going to get into the personal life too much, but just to say the first marriage was a failure. He did have a son via the first wife. They left him and moved west to the West Coast, about as far away as they could get from Henry Shoemaker. And his son was raised by others, although he did provide for that. So don't know all the details around that, but I'll allude to some problems a little later that might give us some clues. He did marry again some years later, and he remained with that wife for the rest of his life. I absolutely love this picture of his library. This is his one of the rooms at Restless Oaks. I've had the privilege of having visited recently, thanks to Guy Graybill and the owner. It doesn't quite look like this, of course. A lot of the antiques are gone. The bookshelves are empty. And that panther, if you look real close, the taxidermied panther up on top of the bookcase was recently written about at the Berks Historical Society in Berks County. There was a presentation about that. Bradley, I think it's Bradley Smith, did that. And I think we tracked down that panther as now being in the state museum. I don't know if it's on display or in storage, but that actual relic is there. But this was his library at Restless Oaks, where he spent a lot of time by the fire, writing a lot of his letters, scratching down on a pad his stories. And he was a very active writer. At different points in his life, he became engaged in working for the government. And I'm not exactly sure how this happened, but he ended up an ambassador to Bulgaria, of all places. So he through his connections. Gifford Pinchot was a very strong connection for him, and others in the administration at the time. That would have been in the 20s and early 30s. He also owned several newspapers. I believe in Altoona. He may have owned the newspaper in Reading for a while, and several others in the region. Through them, he published a lot of his books. So the printing presses were very useful to him also as a book publisher. He was one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Folklore Society, and for a good dozen years or so, he was the state folklorist for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and in fact, the first one. And you can read about that in Simon Bronner's book, Popularizing Pennsylvania, if you're interested in that detail. So I mentioned he was well connected politically. He had a lot of rich friends, a lot of powerful friends, especially Pennsylvanians, very well connected to the Pinchot family and other governors over the years. Wealthy men, part of the civic organizations of the day, very focused on the natural environment. So these gentlemen would go to lodges and hike in the hills and do things like that and worry about preservation, perhaps some state parks and things got started out of this, as well as the roadside historic markers. Shoemaker gets very involved in that, especially as the automobile becomes a thing and people are starting to drive around more and seeing sights. It's important to mark along the road where historic events happened or historic places or people are nearby. And he was a big proponent of that. A problem with his historic markers, though, is a number of them are inaccurate, to put it mildly, and might even contain complete fiction. So there's sort of a concern about that if there's a historic marker that's actually fiction. Henry was also a big collector of things, you name it, artifacts for his Native American, early American, furniture, art, and so on. When he passed away in 1958, there were a number of auctions with amazing things that were sold. And his archives are mostly at Penn State University. So what did Shoemaker write? And forgive me for the eye chart, but it's not my fault. You can blame Shoemaker for this. This is only some of his work. And I'll just give you, hopefully you've got a bigger screen that you can see this. As you peruse it, you can see the three main categories or genres that I would put his work into. His legends and lore, which are mostly short stories. I would not call them history, at least not most of them. They're mostly fictionalized stories, some of them with a basis in truth, but a lot of them also modeled after European folk tales. Then you have his interest in hunting and zoology. He writes about the wildlife in Pennsylvania. It's one of his first books, if not the first book he publishes when he's a young man of 23. So I think that shows his interest in the natural world when he's first starting to live at Restless Oaks after his brother has passed away. And then he follows up with all the people that he meets. He writes about these fantastic hunters and the hunters of the past, the legendary hunters of the past that did fantastic things, and how many wildcats they might have taken, or wolves, or moose, or bear. And of course, a lot of these stories are the kinds of things you'd hear at a lodge after a little bit too much liquor. Maybe exaggerations, but they're very entertaining. And some of the characters and hunters that he writes about are just eccentric people. When I was doing the research on the Pennsylvania Wildcats book, I footnoted it extensively, and I wanted to track down, did all these hunters really exist? Who were these people and these scientists he was writing to? Were they real people? It turned out they all were, and I was really surprised by that. And some of the people that he was saying fantastic things about were supported from other sources. So I think Shoemaker was probably a lot more accurate with his hunting and hunter biography information. On the left, you note I highlighted Juniata Memories, 1916. This is the book from which the Nittany Lion and the Princess Nittany story comes from. So Shoemaker is the foundation of those legends. He wrote them, and then they become part of Penn State lore. So that's the root of that, and one of the reasons why Henry Shoemaker is famous to this day, and his books still sell. You can see on the right, he also had a number of other books, sort of an eclectic collection of things. He got interested in minstrelsy or mountain music. He also claimed to have collected some Indian folk songs. Not sure how he did that. The language of Central Pennsylvania witchcraft. I'm going to look into getting that book. That sounds really, really compelling to check out. But the early Potters of Clinton County, a biography of Captain Logan, it just shows you his diverse interests. So I'm going to give you examples now. I've got 4 of them, and I'll read you some brief passages from 4 of his stories. They're just indicative of his writing style and the content. So in the volume Tales of the Bald Eagle Mountains, published in 1912, this was one of his legends or lore or short story volumes. And there's a really good story. It's one of my favorites, The Lost Chord. And I've talked about this with some friends and family that they should read it. And in this story, The Lost Chord, it reads like a Victorian Twilight Zone tale. Shoemaker's cultured upbringing comes through in this. And also in the story, the protagonist falls in love with a girl on a train, and he later discovers a doll in an antique shop resembling her. So I'm not going to read you all of that, but there's a real twist to this in the end that is a sort of a psychological thriller. It's a little bit different than a lot of the other stories he's written. So here's a taste of Shoemaker's writing from that scene on the train. But now the brakes were being thrown on, and the cumbersome steel cars were coming to a halt beneath the murky shed. The sweet, graceful little creature got up, satchel in hand, and started for the door. I didn't know what to do. Should I follow or remain where I was? Pursuit, the most primitive of masculine instincts, got the upper hand for an instant. Perhaps she would be getting on another train. I might ride it to find out where she lived. I ran through the empty car and out on the station platform. I got there just in time to see her dainty figure ascending the iron stairway leading to the waiting room and street. I hated to follow her. She might lose any good opinion she had of me and stamp me as a masher. When I was reading that, I just envisioned the whole scene in the railroad station with the iron stairs and him running through the train. And so it has great action and description. It also had me look up what was a masher. So that was a gentleman who was pursuing women on trains, I guess. Another one that I also found very entertaining because it kind of draws you into the past and even an earlier time period. This was from In the Seven Mountains, published in 1913. Uncle Job, A Story of Two Comets. And in this story, there's really compelling imagery, and he uses foreshadowing, although you won't get much of an indication of the foreshadowing because you have to read the whole story. He tells the tale of a lad who sees Halley's Comet in 1835 and learns it is to reappear in 1910 and wonders about what it will be like to be an old man so many years later, if he lives that long. Uncle Job Conley was a good-sized boy of 15 when in 1835 he first saw Halley's Comet, the sight of the superb silver aureole tearing its way through the eastern sky made a profound impression on his awakening mind. An old German who was standing near him on the steps of the country store at the same time excitedly exclaimed, "That means another terrible war, or if it doesn't mean that, we are due for another cholera epidemic." After most of the crowd had looked at the silvery orb until long past their bedtimes, and one by one had ambled out the tree-hooded lanes to their quiet little candlelit homes, young Conley stood speechless and alone in admiration. For me, that last sentence says so much. Looking up at the sky and then talking about the people, the tree-hooded lane, imagining a street in the early 1800s with the trees, candles being used as lights, and the young man just standing there by himself, age 15, looking up at the sky in wonder. So I just love that part. All right, one more. On the Ledge is a story from In the Seven Mountains. In the Seven Mountains, published in 1913, has, well, all of his earlier volumes have great stories, just dozens of them altogether. And this one in particular has a lot of action in it. This story recounts a battle between a hunter and a great panther on Mount Nittany. Maybe it was the Nittany lion. Obviously, it isn't, because you'll see how the story ends. It reminds of later works by Hemingway with the gruesome, brutal hunting scene. When Boyer was within 10 feet of the panther, he fired again to ensure the animal was dead before dragging it back on one of the flat rocks and skinning it. This bullet seemed to have the effect of reanimating the dying brute. It rose to its feet like a flash, its eyes blazing fire, its sturdy muscles twitching with fury. Turning about, it sprang at the hunter, who deftly sought to guard himself with his rifle. The weight of the 200-pound monster was too much for him, and he fell on his back on the rocks. If he had pitched forward or sideways, he might have fallen over the precipice. Although down, the hunter was by no means worsted. His hand was on his long hunting knife, and he ripped open the panther's bowels as it lay across him, snarling furiously. With a gasp of pain, as despairing as the last notes of its nocturnal love song, it expired. The little dog, hiding among some hogberry bushes, reappeared and began biting at the carcass. This shows you Shoemaker. This is brutal, writing about a hunting scene, which hand-to-hand fighting of any kind is always very brutal. And I think he describes it so well with the action, the emotion, the fear, and the dog at the end coming out. The little dog that really didn't help gets to bite at the carcass. I thought that was kind of humorous. The last one I'll share with you is from a volume called Black Forest Souvenirs, The Moment the Lights Were Lit. And this is another story about a woman on a train. And there's a theme here about Shoemaker and trains and women. So I ran into this and thought this one was also very interesting, but different than the other story. This story also is about a gentleman who had seen a woman in a town and couldn't find her and comes back after a while to try to locate her. This story contains many wistful descriptions of the region. One of the more historic narratives now on scene in the 21st century concerns a train ride. Once again, Shoemaker describes his character mesmerized by a beautiful girl on a train. He misses an opportunity to introduce himself and then decides to search for her. The eastbound journey seemed longer than the entire trip from New York to Sunbury had been. He chafed and fretted at the slowness in reaching the stations. He barely noticed the ball of the red setting sun poised over the very horizon and spreading its fiery effulgence over the entire broad river. Darkness, sweet, cool summer darkness had settled down. The crickets' chorus wafted through the open car windows. The conductor, especially as self-important as the one on the westbound train had been, called out for the stop at Millersburg. There were still a goodly number of people at the station, which was illuminated by tallow candles set in glass lantern boxes. Hubert scanned their dark faces eagerly. They were not like his fair beloved. Where would he find her? Who would he ask about her? The faces he saw about him seemed to grow unsympathetic and distant, even in the candlelight. He watched the red lights on the rear of the train as it disappeared into the darkness. A feeling of loneliness and desolation overcame him. It was the first time he had felt it in America. There was still light in the station. Through an open window, it poured out on the platform. There was the musical clicking of the telegraph keys. Inside the window sat a young man with black hair and eyes and black side whiskers. He seemed genial and approachable. Whom else could he question? He addressed the operator in broken English, being answered by the youth in phrases equally unfinished. So excellent imagery, very moving, emotional passage. You can sense the anxiousness of the protagonist as he's trying to decide what to do, that he's in this strange place. I also love that it talks about the trip from New York to Sunbury. And if you think about the train ride from New York to Sunbury, that would be something that Shoemaker was very familiar with, having done it many times. And his experiences with the sights and sounds of that, you pick up on that here in this narrative. And you can imagine he's experienced this many times. He's got a lot of details. The conductor calling out, of course, the crickets. I didn't know you'd hear crickets on the train. Uh, the feeling of the air coming through and so on. So the candles as well in the glass lantern boxes. So you know you're back in the 1800s. Now, that's all well and good. Wonderful writing. But some others have had some problems with Shoemaker and or maybe aren't as kind about it. And Guy Graybill, a friend of mine, historian who we've also published, put out a book a few years back where he dubbed Shoemaker the scoundrel of the Susquehanna. And I think in some regard with Shoemaker, if you were somebody that was reading his books as history, and then later on you found out they were fiction, some people were angered by that. Also angered by maybe some of the road signs that aren't exactly depicting history and are more fictional. Specifically, some of the things that are tied to Shoemaker that are questionable. He writes a lot about bison in Pennsylvania, and yet there's no real proof of bison at any great numbers in Pennsylvania. So his stories about great bison hunts and so on could not have been possible in Pennsylvania. He writes a story about, or wrote a story about a 600-mile underground river. Not possible. The Teodotin Elm is a story that many people took to be fact because it was told so well. And this is about the independence of our country, and that some gentleman at a fort a couple days before the actual Congress, Continental Congress in Philadelphia declared independence, the fellows up there decided to do it themselves and wrote their own declaration. They put it into a storage box chest and buried it under the elm. And there it was for many years, supposedly. So a myth, but it really took hold, and a lot of people for many years thought it to be fact. The story of the Huntington Standing Stone and its origins are in question. His portrayal of the Native Americans, certainly the history of these great battles, which sound like European battles, never happened to the degree he describes them. Many of the tribes he talks about never existed. Certainly many of the individuals that he talks about never existed. They're all fictional. He had a tendency when discussing Native culture to overlay them in the sense that they were European nobility. So a chief would be equivalent to a king. Their habits and so on would be described as if they were in a European court. Of course, vastly different cultures in reality. So it sounded very noble to describe the natives that way, and probably is tied to the noble savage genre of literature and history that was popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's some legends tied to Penn's Cave that, of course, are not true, and the Princess Nittany story is repeated in the Penn's Cave book as well. There's a Captain Harry Green, and there was a monument that was erected by Shoemaker and some of his buddies that honored this Captain Harry Green and this massacre, apparently slain by Native Americans. It never happened, but there was 20 years earlier a massacre near Bedford that was similar, but different individuals involved. And then there's the whole issue of Henry's infidelity, and may have contributed to the ending of his first marriage. When researching Henry Shoemaker, he wrote a lot about. In fact, when talking about the hunters, the name Clem Herlocker was coming up a lot. Clem Herlocker was the uncle of a young lady named Hilda Herlocker. He never mentions Hilda, of course, but he talks a lot about Clem. And it seems like Clem being a real person was somebody that he talked to a lot. And he got a bunch of stories out of Clem. And of course, Clem is a prolific hunter that he writes about as well. So Hilda ends up being a longtime mistress of Henry Wharton Shoemaker. And maybe for, well, several decades, they have a relationship, and it's extramarital. I happen to have in my possession a couple hundred letters written by various mistresses to Henry Wharton Shoemaker that he kept. And these were part of the estate that were sold. I'm probably the second or third owner of this batch of letters. No, I have not read them all. I don't know all the content, but I am intrigued by that, and may, in one of my future projects, delve into that and see if I can catalog them, see what I can find there. Not looking for any scandals or anything, but just curious about the who and the what. I was always curious about his connection to the author Herbert Stover, who was a New York Times best-selling novelist in the mid-century, last century, and that they shared this Hilda Herlocker connection. That Hilda was a student of Herbert Stover, and that Hilda seemed to be the person that connects Stover to Shoemaker, and then leads to Stover getting a New York publishing contract. So she's also in the middle of two pretty well-known authors, and there was no malfeasance with Herbert Stover that I could tell. Maybe she was a girlfriend before he got married, but Stover was a pretty straight arrow, and actually seemed to have a falling out from Henry later on. But a very interesting person, Hilda Herlocker, and I think a lot of her letters are sitting not too far from me in a bin here in my office. Now, Shoemaker, he tried to cover himself with a disclaimer, and he did this a number of times. He wanted to be careful. Tried to warn people about his writing that he may be taking some liberties with it. And in one disclaimer, he says, as many of the stories have happened within the memory of man, it has been necessary in many cases to change the names of persons and places, to transpose localities and dates. The writer has done this reluctantly, indeed less than he should have in a few instances. But if some of the sources of this information notice confusion in their stories, they must understand the reason. HWS. He did it reluctantly and less than he should have in a few instances. Not sure what that means, but yeah. The picture there is the grave that I visited near Lock Haven, Henry's grave, and his wife, Mabel. In the opener, Catamount Press, which is an imprint of Sunbury Press, has been reissuing a lot of the Henry Shoemaker books. The ones on the left are published with either their original covers as best we could get them, or maybe the frontispiece used as a cover. And the ones on the right are new cover designs that try to stay with the theme. We will probably roll out several more. There's several more in the pipeline. And we're not just creating facsimiles of the original books. What we're doing is going through them. We're going through and re-editing them, So we're cleaning up a little bit of, some of the typos and things that might have existed, but also cleaning up a little bit of the language, just modernizing it a little bit for modern audiences. So some of the terms are a bit dated. I won't go into them, but we want to preserve the stories as best we can and make them accessible to everybody. The Wildcats in the center, that's an Audubon painting of a Pennsylvania, well, not a Pennsylvania wildcat, but a wildcat. And that's that volume. So we will be donating copies of all the new editions to the State Library. So I'll be doing that very soon. Very excited to continue this work on Henry Shoemaker. He is a fascinating figure. There's a lot there. And I know we still have probably half of his short story legends books to go. I'm sure there's many more gems to be found there, and I'll become aware of them as I move along and do that work. So I'll open it up for questions if anybody wants to know anything more or ask anything.
Yeah, please feel free to add questions and comments here in the chat, and then we will moderate them. I did want to say I get a kick out of the wildcat stories, because that's something that I still hear people talking about. Like, people swear that they see, panthers or wildcats in the wild, and that, that somehow they've escaped, like, any sort of people noticing, and they're living out in the wild areas like Bigfoot or something. So, his legends still carry on, these sort of like mountain stories today. I just love Shoemaker. I think he's such an interesting character, even with his his sort of like exaggerations, or like his romantic spirit just seems to come out in all of his
Absolutely.
writing.
I think with the wildlife in general, he really sort of laments the loss of that as it's fading from the scene. While he glorifies the hunters and what they're doing, they're overhunted, and there were bounties for removing some of these predators like the panthers and lynxes and so on. So he seems to be on both sides of the fence, where he's glorifying the excitement of the hunt, and then he also seems to be missing them, the great creatures of the forest, as well the logging industry, as it takes away the forest and the lumber is used.
Yeah. I'm imagining, what our forests looked like, in Shoemaker's time, after have been, being so more close to the time that they clear cut things, and they were, replanting and, trying to restore what we had lost. Okay, there are a couple questions from the chat here.
Okay.
Where should a new Shoemaker reader start with his books? Do you have a top 5?
Well, not to make this a commercial. I'll tell you what, I started with Susquehanna Legends. That was the first one that came to me. I'd heard of Henry Shoemaker. Guy Grable referred to him as Colonel Shoemaker, and he was involved with Prince Farrington and the liquor trade, bootlegger trade. Shoemaker was mentioned maybe through his political connections. So Guy was the one who introduced him to me. And then one of our other authors, P.J. Picarillo, was talking about how Shoemaker is part of the canon of Western Pennsylvania and Northern Appalachia. And I was like, okay, well, I need to read Shoemaker. So I was out in an antique mart walking around, and I saw this book, Susquehanna Legends, one of the original copies setting out. And I thought, oh, Henry Shoemaker, Susquehanna Legends. So that's the one that came to me first, and that's the first one that we republished. Once I read them, I was hooked. I just fell in love with his storytelling. It didn't matter to me that it wasn't historical fact. I bought it as an historian thinking, I'd heard this has some local history in it. Well, not really. So that one is a good place to start. In the Seven Mountains. If you're interested in the Penn State legends, the Juniata Memories, is another one. So, yeah, good question.
Okay, can the public tour Restless Oaks?
The public cannot tour it. You would have to get permission from the owner. It's privately owned.
Mm-hmm.
It should be a state landmark. It really should be if the state had the money, the taxpayers wanted to do so. It's a beautiful home. And of course, it has all this history associated with him as a literary giant. It's close to, I forget the highway that runs along the river there at Macklehattan, but it's actually, I think now it's close to a prison too, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But you get a sense of his setting and where he lived and worked. So no, you can't get in it. It would be great if you could. It is still there in fairly good condition, very similar to how it was around the time he passed away 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. There's another comment that the Restless Oaks restaurant is near Macklehattan. Do you know if there's a relation to Shoemaker and the Restless Oak estate?
so the relationship is only in the name, as far as I know.
Ah.
Yes, I think they borrowed the name of the Restless Oaks estate and dubbed the restaurant Restless Oaks. It's very much of like a wooden forest lodge kind of feel. I think it's made of log, or you get the sense of it being as such. And I've been there a few times. It's your typical country diner food and just good people. And some of the old fellows that sit around there and talk more and when they were young and tell stories about them. So you can still hear that if you
Wow,
go there. Yeah.
that's really cool.
hmm
Carla asks if you know anything about what became of the son. If, as everything in the estate was later auctioned, it seems likely that he ended up living a life apart and not as the son of a well-known writer.
Yes, that is true. As far as I know, the son was taken under the wing of his first wife and their family. Henry provided money at that time. What I know about Shoemaker's estate, at least the physical property, I don't know about any money that he might have had if that somehow went to the son, but perhaps the sale of the estate and all the contents went to the son. I don't know for sure. It's very likely that it might have. Actually, you know what? I'll take that back. The second wife would have complicated that because she outlived Henry, so she would have received all those proceeds, and then she would have been directing what happened to it after that. So, the auctions, I believe there were several of them, and he had a great collection of taxidermy. He had antique weapons, Native American artifacts, extensive book collection. His letters, the things he's written in a correspondence, invaluable. I know a lot of that is at Penn State. I think some of it's at Susquehanna University. So if you're interested in researching him, there are some great archives of his writings and his correspondence to and from. And if you're ever interested in the 100 to 200 love letters he received, I have those. But you'll probably be donating to one of those archives at some point. Yeah.
Very good. Christian asks, if there was still an official Pennsylvania state folklorist position, who would you nominate now?
Oh boy. I don't know anybody who's writing new Pennsylvania folklore. Shoemaker was such a giant of it. I would probably, if Jeffrey Frazier's listening, I'll embarrass him.
I was gonna say that.
Jeffrey Frazier. Now I say this. Please understand, we publish Jeffrey's books, but I don't say this because of that. I say it because I know Jeffrey. I know the conversations he and I have had many times over lunch or dinner about Shoemaker. And Jeffrey's done a good job of telling more stories that have been told to him, legends that have been told to him, but also debunking a lot of the Shoemaker stories or maybe adding to them. So if there's a follow along to Shoemaker, it'd probably be Frazier, who's the most prolific. He's got maybe 10, 15 books now. So yeah, Jeffrey Frazier.
That's great. Well, thank you. I think that concludes all our questions that were here in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining our program today. Again, this was recorded. It will be up on our State Library website, linked in probably a couple weeks when PDE can get to it. And thank you again, Mr. Knorr, for providing us such a great program today. And hopefully everybody has been inspired to go out and read some Pennsylvania folklore, some old stories, and learn more about Shoemaker. Thank you so much, Mr. Knorr.
Thank you.